All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience and for being here. This is our program called QueerX, which is a program that's new for the Gender and Sexuality Center, and really with the idea of creating an educational platform to talk about critical conversations that impact the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual communities. And so today, our talk is going to be about addressing sexual violence in LGBTQIA communities. My name is Steph Willenchek, and I'm the director of the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life, and I'm with my co-presenter.
My name is Malik Mitchell, and I'm the Men's Engagement Coordinator over at the Aurora Center.
So we're also being filmed right now. Our hope was to be live streamed, but that's not going to happen today. So this presentation will be posted on our website as well, so folks can share it or come back and look at it as well. So we're going to probably talk to you all for about 30 minutes and then have some opportunity for questions and answers. I know for myself, talking about sexual violence can be very triggering conversation at times, so I just sort of want to put that out there. So we are going to be mostly talking about facts and figures and some of the impacts to LGBTQIA communities. We're not going to go super deep in the conversation, but just please take care of yourself in whatever ways you need to during this conversation. And yeah, I think that's it. Do you have anything else you want to share?
Not really. I'm a state-certified sexual violence crisis counselor, so if anything does come up for you and you'd like to talk about it after, I'm always available for that.
Yes. And I too have worked probably about 10 years or so professionally, but just throughout my life in sexual violence work and anti-violence work as well. So yeah, great. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. What we were going to do first is spend some time talking about some main points that I think come from both of us in ways of how we think about sexual violence as it relates to LGBTQIA communities, kind of just as frames for this conversation and some ideas around it, things that I know I've learned throughout my work or either read about or thought about. The first that I think is important is that sexual violence is present both within and used against LGBTQIA communities. So meaning sexual violence happens within intimate relationships, acquaintance relationships, and is also a weapon towards LGBTQIA communities.
And one of our second main points is that sexual violence is framed through a very heterosexist and cisgendered lens, and dismantling that is very difficult.
With this in mind too, stranger sexual assaults are more likely in the LGBTQIA communities, more likely to be reported than oftentimes we see in heterosexual communities. So 10% of hate crimes, sexual violence or sexual assault is part of that hate crime, which isn't necessarily true for folks who are heterosexual.
And another main point that we'll be getting into a little bit later in our presentation when we talk about barriers to reporting is that the impact of homo, bi, and transphobia in reporting sexual violence.
And also noting that those phobias are very much present in the systems of response and support and part of our broader culture. So sort of trickle down to the institutions and organizations and systems that are in place to support victims and survivors of sexual violence.
And something else that we see is the hypersexualization of the LGBTQIA folks leads individuals and communities to think sexual violence does not occur. That happens both within community and outside of the community.
Oppression, stigmatization, and hypersexualization and stereotypes often lead to LGBTQIA people to be stereotyped as predators, especially of children. And this is, I think, a big stereotype that many folks in LGBTQIA communities is used as a microaggression, as an overt aggression towards folks, and it comes out in conversations when we're talking about youth and LGBTQIA communities.
So reparative or corrective therapy targeted towards asexual and other LGBTQ communities. We're seeing this come up a lot in our conversations around the election and conversations around conversion therapy for LGBTQIA folks.
And that still happens. It's still part of therapy structures throughout the United States. There's also the myth that if you are LGBTQIA, it's because you had, quote, a bad experience with someone of a different gender, or that maybe sexual violence occurred and therefore now you're LGBTQIA. And that questioning or that assumption can be very dismissive for LGBTQIA people and survivors and victims of violence.
Homo, bi, and transphobia leads to LGBTQIA folks to think that sexual violence is just a part of the community, i.e. gay sex has no boundaries, it's just, or no one else will love me and I deserve this.
Also sort of the broader system of heterosexism, the idea that heterosexuality is the only normal, natural way of being, and we have systems that are structured to reinforce that. So heterosexism may force LGBTQI folks to consent to sexual activity in order to, quote, prove themselves. So often the societal pressure to be in heterosexual sexual relationships.
And gender expression and identity impacts who is perceived as a victim or a perpetrator of sexual violence.
And noting also a person may be a perpetrator and also a survivor of sexual violence too, and holding those two things in place is important, especially in the context of LGBTQIA identities.
And our last kind of main point that we're going to talk about is transgender people and bisexual women face the most alarming rates of sexual violence, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation.
So some of the common fears that are out there and reported in terms of coming from LGBTQIA folks that are survivors or victims of sexual assault. One is being forced to come out if they report their sexual assault. So having to describe what occurred, whether it's a hate crime or whether it's a acquaintance or interpersonal relationship, having to out themselves in fear that the response within the systems, to friends, to family, to reporting agencies. Also, sort of tied with that too, is that fear of betraying the LGBTQIA communities, which are already under attack. So I know for myself as a queer and trans person, having to report someone that I know who is also part of the LGBTQIA community that I know might then experience a lot of homophobia and transphobia, I might want to resist that because even though I want to report the violence and what happened, I also don't want that person to be impacted by the systems. And that can lead to that fear of feeling that exposing perpetrators to the criminal justice and response systems can maybe even potentially reproduce violence too, as we will look at some of the statistics that LGBTQIA folks experience within the systems. And oftentimes LGBTQI folks might feel that they have nowhere to turn for help, and just that overarching feel of hostile responses, and especially if they're already in a place where they're experiencing that hostility.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about lesbian, bi, pansexual, and cis is in parentheses right there because we'll talk about trans folks a little bit later in the presentation, women and sexual violence. So this information comes from the CDC's National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey, which this information was collected in 2010 and published in 2011. So it talks a little bit about the experiences of cis, lesbian, and bisexual women, and we come up with their experiences. So 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% of heterosexual women. And our second bullet point there is 46% of bisexual women have been raped compared to 17% of the heterosexual women and 13% of lesbians.
Our next set of stats is regarding gay, bi, cis men and sexual violence. So and this is also coming from CDC's National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey. So they report that 26% of gay men and 37% of bisexual men experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 29% of heterosexual cis men. And then 40% of gay men and 47% of bisexual men have experienced sexual violence other than rape, compared to about 21% of heterosexual cis men. So there's a myth out there, I think, regarding broadly men and sexual violence, but in particular with gay men, that only gay men sexually assault other men. I think that's because we're so hypersexualized and seen as perpetrators broadly in society, that this kind of filters down to this conversation. When in reality, most men who are sexually assaulted by other men identify themselves as heterosexual. And it sort of reinforces the idea that sexual violence is about power and control, not sex or sexual orientation.
So this survey is a very interesting one because it's one of the first and most broad surveys conducted informing the experience of trans and gender nonconforming folks. Unfortunately, this survey doesn't include information on intersex folks. This survey was conducted in 2011 and published in 2012. The next installment of this, recording 2015 date, is actually set to be released next week. Yeah, it's coming up pretty fast. This survey includes responses from 6,400 trans folks, and then the one that's set next week, to be released next week, includes 28,000. So it's a lot broader picture of the experiences of trans and gender nonconforming folks in the United States and their experience with discrimination. So most studies reveal that approximately 50% of transgender people experience sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. 10% of transgender individuals have been sexually assaulted in at least one healthcare setting. 22 to 38% of trans people have been harassed by police. 15% experience physical violence, and 7% being sexual assault by law enforcement. And we'll talk a little bit about response teams when it comes to reporting and barriers to reporting. So keep these facts in mind when we get to that presentation.
Yeah, and I think these statistics really highlight some of our main points too around that fear of reporting folks, especially trans and gender nonconforming folks, into the system. So we also wanted to share just a highlight a study that Boynton Health Services did here. Boynton Health Services is our health service on campus, if you're not aware of that already. But they did, it was between 2000 and 2011 that they surveyed 40 college students on 40 different campuses, both 2-year and 4-year, to get this data. And so it brings it down just a little bit to home in terms of talking about the impact to students. So this is a comparison of Boynton data through the result of their surveying. And they only surveyed around sexual orientation, so there's nothing regarding gender identity. They do highlight sex identity, so male and female, in these statistics. So what has really been shown here too highlights, I think, some of the statistics we already shared and what we're seeing on college campuses or with college students across Minnesota. A couple points I want to make sure I touch on. Almost double the numbers of sexual assault for female-identified lesbian and bi students versus stranger peers. So if you see that in this first set of data here. And 5 times more likely to report sexual violence for gay and bi male-identified students versus straight peers. So we see the disparities for LGBTQ folks, both in on sort of the college campus data, as well as we see that replicated with the CDC information as well. Although we see with the non-rape sexual violence from the CDC, some comparisons, but if you look in particular at the statistics for bisexual women are extremely high, as we referenced earlier, the health disparities and the potential for violence for bisexual, and we'll talk about trans folks, is pretty extreme. So one thing we want to mention as well, going back to one of our points, is this concept of corrective rape, which impacts, well, corrective rape is a hate crime in which one or more people are raped because of their perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. The common intended consequence of the rape, as seen by the perpetrator, is to turn the person heterosexual or sexual in the case of asexual people, or to enforce conformity with gender stereotypes. The threat of corrective rape may disproportionately impact some international students, some students that we work with here on campus who might fear if they come out here on campus in the US and go back to their countries and folks find out about their identities, that they might be forced to have corrective rape. Although this is only in some countries, this is not across the board, or these are also fears that folks might have within the US as well. And also the threat to asexual students or asexual folks as well.
So here are a few of the challenges we see that folks encounter when they choose to report sexual violence. The denial of services. 85% of victim advocates surveyed by the NCAVP reported having worked with an LGBTQIA survivor who was denied services because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So the queer community is very small, so if somebody has a negative experience with a specific service, they're going to inform their friends that they shouldn't go there, that if they have a problem, they should see somebody else, or they shouldn't talk to anybody about it at all. So then we would talk about violence in these institutions, and some of them come from police, healthcare providers, and others within response systems may limit reporting and reduce trust in the system. Additionally, 22% of those transgender folks who have attempted to access shelters report being sexually assaulted by either another person in the shelter or by shelter staff. So word travels very quickly that these services aren't ones that you want to access, and if you do access them, that something bad might happen to you while you're using the services.
So what we wanted to also do is just share, in particular, some tips for working with transgender survivors of sexual violence, trans and gender nonconforming folks. Noting that some of these things also, I think, are great tips no matter what a person's gender or sexuality might be. First and foremost, continuing ongoing training, educating yourself and others, and in particular if you're working within sexual violence response fields, but just in general, helping to reduce the stereotypes that exist in our culture. So also examining your own fears, stereotypes, implicit biases, and phobias. I know for myself, when I think about sexual violence and LGBTQIA folks, I sometimes look to the media, and even those subtleties that happen sometimes in movies and depictions of who's the bad person. Sometimes that person is exhibiting gender expression that's outside the norm or expectation. Sometimes they're perceived as being LGBTQIA. And so thinking about that and trying to push back on those stereotypes. Also more specific, using inclusive forms and write clear policies that include all genders. So where within your organization or the work that is being done do you see barriers around gender? And sometimes that's with language or how we're asking questions or how we're engaging with one another. It's really important to refer to clients with the language they use as it relates to their gender. That can mean pronouns, relationships, names. So if you are someone that's engaging with LGBTQIA survivors, really looking to the survivor and victim to share that information. Listen, believe, and ask relevant questions. Avoid curiosity questions. Unfortunately, this is not uncommon for trans and gender nonconforming folks to have really inappropriate questions asked about their body, their genitalia, surgeries that they may or may have not had, maybe coming from just the intention of curiosity. For some folks, it might be new that they might be meeting a trans person for the first time and see that person as someone that will share everything. Some folks might be willing to share things, but it needs to come from them first, not just out of a person's own curiosity. Don't assume causality, which I think is true across the board for any victim or survivor. There, again, are many ways that LGBTQI folks are hypersexualized or might be seen as it was their fault because they were sexually violated. Why did you do this? Why were you wearing this? You shouldn't have been out in this situation, things like that. So working not to do that. And then also, in particular with trans and gender nonconforming folks, really consider how we've been treated systematically all those ways that we're invisible in the world and how we're targeted as well. So, just going to touch this, make sure. Okay. We're headed to the end of our presentation, and we'll be open for questions, but we just wanted to share a few resources. These are off-campus resources. So there's a National Coalition for Anti-Violence Programs that we referenced earlier. It's a great website to look at nationally what is going on in regards to LGBTQIA violence prevention and response across the country. Outfront Minnesota, which is the Minnesota LGBTQ advocacy organization, has an anti-violence program. That's a wonderful place to look and get connected with as well and to learn more. And so that's their website, and they're located here in the Twin Cities. And then we also wanted to highlight too some resources for asexual survivors or ACE survivors, because asexuality, I think, is identity that's very much marginalized, both in broader society and within LGBTQIA communities, and also times heavily targeted for sexual violence. So that's another resource as well. And then we have us as resources in our offices. So I don't know if you want to talk about your office for a second.
Yeah, so I work over at the Aurora Center, which is in Appleby Hall. It's right across the street. I'm glad this was across the street, or else I would have gotten lost. Started here not too long ago. So in our office, we do offer free and confidential services, which include walk-in. You can talk to somebody about your experience. We do offer legal services, helping folks fill out orders for protections, restraining others, or other legal forms. So if you need help filing those, we'll file them for you, so you don't have to do that. We have a 24-hour helpline. We offer legal services, like lawyers, if you choose to take your case to trial. We help people navigate the university's reporting options, so we can help do a lot of things like that.
In our office, the Gender and Sexuality Center for Queer and Trans Life, we're located in the same building as the Aurora Center. We're in the basement area, and we do a lot of education, advocacy, outreach, and support for LGBTQIA and related communities. Sometimes we might be a first point of contact for LGBTQIA survivors or folks wanting more information and education. We oftentimes refer folks to the Aurora Center or other places depending on the situation, but we're another resource as well here on campus. So that is all that we have in regards to our PowerPoint. So would love to open it up to folks if people have questions or things they'd want to add to what we've been talking about.
Could you go back to that graph that had the youth reporting versus the national?
Yes. So I'm going to repeat, I'll do my best to repeat. So we're going to go back to the graph from Boynton. Yes.
So most of those trends look relatively similar across the board, but it looks like male experiences at the U are maybe a little lower than the national trend. And I'm wondering if you have like interpretations of that, if you think that's a difference in male reporting on our campus, or other ideas about why that looks a little bit different from the other trends.
And you're talking amongst all males, regardless of sexual orientation?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. That male-female discrepancy seems like males are much lower on our campus.
Mm-hmm. Do you have thoughts, Malik?
I think that might have something to do with more perceived anonymity when reporting to the CDC, because it goes out in the survey and you don't actually have to see anyone when you're doing that type of survey, as opposed to, I'm sure there was still obviously confidentiality and anonymity when Boynton was doing their survey, but the fact that you live here, you go to school here, and things like that might deter people from reporting their experiences. I think a lot of folks' experience with masculinity in general might be another barrier to reporting, especially when we're thinking about the age group that typically goes to your traditionally aged college students, 18 to 22, are dealing with a lot of other societal pressures as well. So thinking about reporting any type of sexual assault or sexual experiences, maybe they don't understand what happened to them to be sexual assault, because we don't necessarily give men the same messages about being violated sexually that we give women.
I mean, my kind of assumption in looking at that is that that's a reporting thing and not necessarily reflective of different rates of it happening here.
Yeah, well, and yeah, I think that's a good point. Could very well be, yeah. And I think that's true, I mean, all the data that we share too, it's also about who has access to reporting, who has the ability to do that, who's being asked. So there are all those nuances. Yeah. There's another question?
Yeah, mine was more about the National Transgender Discrimination Survey
Mm-hmm.
and where to just like find that. You said that like an updated version was coming out next week.
Yeah, so if you just search injustice at every turn, it should pop up. They have a website, the National Center for Transgender Equality is where it's housed. They have an executive summary, so it's just highlighting the most hit points of the full report, because the full report is like 230 pages. But you can download them for free online, or you can request a hard copy. And there's a launch event next week, I think it's Thursday, which might be the 8th, I'm not sure. It's next Thursday. Where they will be releasing the 2015 data, and they will also have information on discrimination in bathrooms, because that was something really important that we talked about in the last couple of years with bathroom bills. So yeah, this report is very easily accessible.
Just regarding bisexual individuals, why do you think the rates are so much higher regarding sexual violence? I mean, I know there's a lot of hypersexualization, but is that like the main cause? Or?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm just going to kind of go off my own personal opinion. And there might be more information out there, and Malik, if you have thoughts. I think there's actually quite a number of health disparities for bisexual folks compared to lesbian gay folks. And I think some of that can be attributed to the added forms of oppression that many bi folks experience. They might experience biphobia and monosexism in both sort of heterosexual communities as well as gay and lesbian communities. And so that kind of double impact. And then there's also an immense amount of invisibility and that hypersexualization, I think kind of both areas. Oftentimes, at least anecdotally, what I see is in terms of, in particular, cis women, but women or femme-presenting folks that are bi get very hypersexualized, and bi men or masculine folks might be perceived as invisible or sort of in that their sexualities really aren't true or real. So I think for me that kind of, I think it confounds some situations as well. But that again is just sort of my opinion. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I think I'd say pretty much the same, and then I think a lot of widely held perceptions in our larger society that bisexual people are just going through a stage in their sexuality, and that enacting some of those myths that we talked about in our main points, that they might have had a bad experience with so-and-so, so they can't choose, like you want to have it all, stuff like that.
Yeah, and ideas of sort of corrective rape may come up, things like that. Other thoughts? We'll be hanging out for a while here as well, so if you do have any follow-up questions, and this is also true for folks who might be viewing this presentation online at a later date, please feel free to contact us if you have any other questions or comments or want to get involved in any way. We feel like this is a conversation that we don't have enough on campus and are hoping to find many different ways that we can continue to do this type of programming and continue to advocate for understanding of LGBTQIA communities in the context of sexual violence. So, thank you all for being here.